The wind came down off the ridge like something with a grievance. Cal Danner felt it cut through the gap in his coat collar, felt it find the old scar along his jaw the way cold always found old wounds first. He stood at the edge of a stranger's property line, one boot on the frozen creek bank, one hand resting against a fence post that had been leaning southwest for what looked like 3 winters running. The barbed wire sagged between posts like a man too tired to hold himself upright. 2 of the posts were cracked straight through, held together by nothing more than rust and inertia. He had not meant to stop here. He had been riding the long way around the Coldwater Basin, pushing his horse, Gideon, through the grey mid-morning light of a Montana December that seemed to have no intention of ever becoming afternoon. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the snow on the ground had that particular crust to it, the kind that made every step sound like breaking something. He had meant to reach Harlan's Ferry before nightfall, maybe find a room above the feed store the way he had done twice before when work was thin and the road was long. Then he heard the child. Not crying, exactly. More like a sound caught between crying and something harder, the sound a person makes when they have already cried past the point of tears and what is left is just raw, open breath. He heard it through the wind, and he turned Gideon toward it the way a compass needle turns north, without deciding to. What he found was a boy, no older than 7, standing in the snow outside a farmhouse that looked like it had been fighting the weather for years and was finally beginning to lose. The boy was barefoot. He was holding a tin pail and staring at a pen of listless cattle with the expression of someone who had been sent to do a job and only just realized he did not know how to do it. Cal dismounted. The boy looked up at him the way animals look at strangers, measuring, still, not yet ready to run. "You the man of this house?" Cal asked, and meant it sincerely, without condescension. The boy's chin lifted. "Since October," he said. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button right now and ring that bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, settle in, because this one is going to stay with you. The boy's name was Thomas. He was 7 years and 4 months old, and he announced this the way some men announce their rank, as information you ought to have before proceeding further. His sister, Nora, was 9 and said nothing when Cal followed Thomas onto the porch. She stood in the doorway with a cast-iron skillet held at her side and her dark eyes moving between the stranger and her brother with the practiced wariness of a child who had learned that surprises rarely improved things. "Your mother home?" Cal asked. "She's sick," Thomas said. "Been sick 3 days." Nora's grip on the skillet did not loosen. Cal did not move toward the door. He stood where he was, on the bottom porch step, and took off his hat. "I don't need to come inside," he said. "But that fence on your south line is about to let your cattle into the creek basin, and once cattle find a hole in a fence, they remember it. You'll lose half of them before spring." "We know about the fence," Nora said. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice was flat and clear as creek water. "I can fix it," Cal said. "I don't want money. I saw you don't have cattle that are feeding right. You give me milk from whatever cow is still producing, just enough for a day or 2. I'll fix that fence and look at whatever else is about to fall down before it falls." The children looked at each other. That particular sibling language, fast, wordless, ancient, passed between them. Nora stepped back from the door. Not an invitation. Just a concession. He found their mother in the back room, under 2 quilts, her face the color of birch bark. She was younger than he expected, maybe 30, maybe less, though hardship had a way of adding years that didn't belong to a person. Her name was Ruth Caswell. He knew the name, vaguely, the way you know the names of people in a county when you've passed through enough times. Her husband, Dean Caswell, had died in October when his horse threw him against a boulder crossing the 10 Mile in high water. He had heard it mentioned in a feed store 2 towns over, delivered between 2 other pieces of news the way most deaths were in small places, matter-of-factly, quickly, and then moved past. Ruth Caswell looked at him from beneath the quilts with fever-bright eyes and the careful expression of a woman who had long since stopped expecting help to arrive. "I told them not to open the door to strangers," she said. "Your south fence is going," he said. "And your children haven't eaten a proper meal in what looks like a few days." She closed her eyes. Something moved across her face that was not quite shame and not quite grief, something in the country between them. "There's flour," she said. "And I believe there's still some salt pork in the cold box." "Then I'll get to work," he said. He settled his hat back on his head and left the room. He fixed the fence first. He worked for 2 hours in the bitter cold, resetting posts with the iron driver he found in the leaning barn, restringing wire, tamping frozen earth back around the bases with a spade and the heel of his boot. Thomas followed him the whole time, holding tools when asked, asking questions when not, good questions. The kind that showed the boy was actually watching what Cal was doing rather than simply waiting for it to be done. Nora watched from the porch until the cold drove her back inside. By the time he finished the fence and brought the cattle back from where they'd begun drifting toward the creek bank, the light had shifted to that low amber gray that came an hour before Montana dark in December. His fingers had gone from painful to numb and back to painful again, which he knew meant they were still his. He worked the barn next. Not everything, there was too much for one afternoon. But the latch on the main stall was broken and had been replaced with a length of rope that a determined horse could have worked free in 10 minutes. He replaced it with a proper iron hook he found in a coffee can on a shelf beside 3 dried-out cans of harness oil and a child's lost mitten. He milked the one cow that was still cooperating, a broad, patient roan that regarded him with the dignified indifference of a creature that had seen many strangers come and go. He carried the milk inside. The kitchen was cold in that particular way of rooms where a fire has not been properly tended, not the cold of outside but the cold of abandonment, a still, stale cold that clung to everything. Dishes had been washed and stacked but not fully dried. Ash had built up in the firebox past where it should have been cleared. A broom leaned against the wall with a broken handle, propped so it would not fall. Cal built the fire first. Then he cleared the ash. Then he found a pot and set water to boil, and began going through what was available with the methodical patience of a man who had cooked for himself in rough circumstances long enough to know that nearly anything could become a meal if you gave it enough heat and time. Salt pork, cut thin and rendered in the bottom of the skillet until the fat ran clear. Flour made into a rough biscuit dough, cut into rounds and set to cook in the rendered grease. A half onion, shriveled but usable, sliced fine and cooked down until it turned sweet and golden. He found 3 small potatoes in a sack near the back door, cut them into the pot with the water, added salt, added the last of the pork fat, and let it all come up to a thick, heavy simmer. Thomas sat at the kitchen table and watched him with an expression that was trying hard to be neutral and not quite succeeding. "You know how to cook?" the boy asked. "I know how to not starve," Cal said. "It's not the same thing." Nora set the table without being asked. She did it with a precise, deliberate care, a napkins folded, the crooked chair placed at the end where its crookedness would matter least. These were things she had been taught. That fact sat in the room quietly. Cal brought a bowl of the potato soup to Ruth Caswell first. He set it on the small table beside her bed with a spoon and a biscuit and a cup of the warm milk, which he had sweetened with the last 2 inches from a jar of sorghum he'd found on a shelf behind the salt. He did not wait to see if she ate it. He went back to the kitchen. They ate together, the 3 of them, at that unsteady table in the firelight. The children ate with the focused, quiet urgency of people who have not had enough and are not yet ready to believe there will be more. Cal ate slowly, watching the fire, and when Thomas looked up and found him watching, Cal looked at the fire instead. "You staying?" Thomas asked. "Through winter," Cal said, as if he had already decided it, which, he realized, he had. "If your mother agrees." Nora looked at her soup. "She'll agree," she said, quietly and with certainty. "She's not foolish." He slept in the barn. He had offered to, and Ruth Caswell had not argued, which told him everything about the state of her pride versus the state of her circumstances. He made himself a bed in the loft above the roan cow's stall, where the animal heat rose through the hay in a way that was not comfortable, exactly, but was survivable. He had slept in worse places for worse reasons. By the fourth morning, he had established a rhythm with the ranch the way you establish a rhythm with a difficult piece of country, carefully, with attention, not forcing it. He was up before light. Fire in the kitchen stove first, water heated, coffee made from the thin tin of grounds Ruth kept on the second shelf. He left a cup on the table for whoever came down first. Then the barn, feeding the stock, milking, checking the patched fence line for overnight frost damage. By the time Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing his eyes with his fists like a much younger child than he wanted to be, there was warmth in the house and something on the stove. The boy had a talent for cattle that he did not yet know how to name. Cal noticed it on the fifth day, when he was trying to get the two younger heifers back into the east pen after they had pushed through a soft spot in the inner fence. He was moving too fast, he knew, pushing them with the urgency of a man trying to finish the job, and the heifers were reading it and backing up, confused and contrary. Thomas appeared at the fence line and simply stood there, still as a post, and the heifers, after a moment of consideration, moved toward the gate as if it had been their idea. Cal stopped. Watched. Said nothing. Thomas closed the gate latch and looked back at his hands like they had done something interesting. "How do you know to do that?" Cal asked. "My father showed me," Thomas said, and then said nothing else, and Cal did not ask. Nora was a different kind of study. She did not warm to him gradually the way Thomas did. She remained watchful, precise, and at arm's length, which Cal respected entirely. What he noticed was that she began leaving things. A cup of coffee refilled when he had not asked. His hat moved from the peg near the door to the higher peg where it would not get knocked by the door swinging open in wind. A tear in his coat sleeve, patched with a small, near-invisible stitch of dark thread. She never mentioned these things. Neither did he. Ruth Caswell was on her feet by the sixth day, thinner than she should have been, moving carefully and with the determined precision of someone who could not afford the indulgence of full recovery. She came to the kitchen doorway and watched Cal make breakfast, and he could feel her measuring the situation, not him, exactly, but the shape of what had happened in her house while she was too sick to prevent or invite it. "I can take over the cooking," she said. "I don't mind it," he said. He turned to look at her directly. "You're not steady enough for the stove yet." She did not argue, which cost her something. He could see that it did. What she did, instead, was sit at the table and begin mending a harness that had been sitting in a bucket in the corner waiting for someone with the strength to deal with it. She worked at it in silence while he cooked, and the kitchen held both of them in that silence. And after a while it was not an uncomfortable silence but something that had texture to it, the texture of two people who are learning each other's rhythms without making a ceremony of it. 40 miles south and east, in the town of Bitter Creek, a man named Lyle Caswell was drinking his third whiskey of the morning. Lyle was Dean Caswell's brother by blood and by not much else. He was wide through the shoulders, narrow through the conscience, and had been looking at the Caswell ranch since Dean had married Ruth 11 years ago with the particular hunger of a man who believes something has been taken from him by someone else's good fortune. He had not offered to help when Dean died. He had waited 2 weeks and then sent a letter suggesting that the ranch, being a Caswell family property by history if not by deed, ought to be returned to Caswell family hands, since Ruth was clearly unable to manage it. Ruth had not replied. The man beside Lyle at the bar was a thin, horse-faced individual named Spratt, who made himself useful to people with money and no scruples, and who had recently returned from the Coldwater Basin with news. "She's got a man out there," Spratt said, turning his glass in small circles on the bar. "Big fella. Danner, I think they call him. Seen him in the yard with the kids, working the fence line. Sleeping in the barn, from what I could tell." Lyle said nothing for a moment. "A widow woman," he said finally, "with a drifter on her property and 2 small children. That's what I saw." "That's not decent," Lyle said, though what moved behind his eyes was not concern for decency. "That ranch needs family management. Someone needs to make that case to the county. Spratt turned his glass. Someone needs to, Lyle said again, and smiled the small, patient smile of a man who is comfortable waiting for things to rot. They went into Harlan's Ferry on a Tuesday, which was the day the supply wagon from the Eastern Depot came through, and Cal had a list that Ruth had written in her careful school teacher's hand: flour, dried beans, lamp oil, salt, a paper of needles, 2 yards of wool flannel for the children's coats that had worn thin at the elbows. He drove the buckboard. Ruth sat beside him on the bench, and the children rode in the bed behind with a canvas torp over their legs against the cold. The road into town was mostly hard-packed ice over frozen mud, and Gideon pulled steady and reliable, ears forward, unbothered by the wind. Harlan's Ferry was a single main street flanked by the kinds of buildings that looked like they had been dropped there temporarily and never gotten around to moving on. A general store. A feed store. A saloon that tried to look modest and didn't quite manage it. A church that needed paint. A building with a hand-lettered sign that said Land Registrar and Notary, which shared its space with a dentist, the cohabitation of which struck Cal as an appropriate pairing of necessary pains. Ruth went to the general store. Cal went to the feed store for stock supplements and additional fence wire. The plan was to meet back at the buckboard in an hour. The trouble started, as it usually did in small towns, at the point where gossip had been allowed to move faster than truth. Cal was settling the account at the feed store, $2.60, which he paid from his own pocket and wrote in the ledger beside Ruth Caswell's name, when he became aware of 2 men near the stove who had stopped their conversation in the specific way that meant. They were having a different, louder conversation with their silence. He loaded the wire onto the buckboard and was carrying the second sack of supplement when a man in a wool overcoat and a clean hat stepped into his path with the deliberate body language of someone. "Who has rehearsed this?" "You, Dana?" or the man asked. "That's right," Cal said. "I'm Judge Clement Foote," the man said. "Not an official judgment, I should clarify. I served as Justice of the Peace for 12 years. So the title stays with a man." He said it the way men always say things that are somewhat embarrassing about themselves, as if the saying made it less so. "I understand you're living out at the Caswell place." "Working it," Cal said. "Sleeping in the barn." "A widow woman," Foote said, as if the fact were a notation in a ledger rather than a comment about a human being. "2 children. And a man of no established local standing." Cal set the sack down on the buckboard bed and turned to face Foote fully. He did not crowd him. He simply gave the man his complete attention, which seemed to make Foote slightly less comfortable than he had anticipated. "Her fence was down," Cal said. "Her cattle were going into the creek basin. Her children hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days and she was sick with fever." "What would your established local standing have suggested as the correct response to those facts, Judge?" Foote opened his mouth and then closed it. A man behind him, younger, eager in the way of someone looking to align himself with the prevailing wind, said, "It's the appearance of the thing." Cal looked at the younger man long enough that the younger man found something in the middle distance to study. "The appearance of a fixed fence," Cal said. "The appearance of fed children. I can live with that appearance." He picked up the sack and settled it in the buckboard. "If there's a law in this county against a man doing honest work for fair compensation, someone ought to write it down where I can see it." He walked back into the feed store for the 3rd sack. Inside the general store, Ruth Caswell was having a version of the same conversation conducted more quietly but with no less sharpness. The woman behind the counter was a Mrs. Aldrich, plump, certain of herself, with the particular authority of someone who has been delivering the community's mail and gossip from the same counter for 20 years and has ceased to distinguish between the two. "You'll want to be careful," Mrs. Aldrich said, in the tone of someone who is not being careful themselves, about how this looks to people. "A widow woman has to think about her reputation just as much as her fences." Ruth Caswell set her list on the counter and looked at it for a moment. "Mrs. Aldrich," she said finally, "my children were hungry. My fence was failing. My cattle were drifting. A man offered to fix those things in exchange for honest milk. I took the offer. She looked up. I would do it again tomorrow without a moment's hesitation. And any woman in this county who would choose her reputation over her children's dinner is welcome to her opinion of me. Mrs. Aldrich filled the order in silence. They ate lunch together on the buckboard before driving home. Cold biscuits Ruth had brought from the house, a jar of preserves she had bought at the general store. A small paper twist of peppermint drops she had tucked into her coat pocket for the children. She handed Nora and Thomas each 2 peppermints with the precise, deliberate care of someone who has calculated that 2 is sustainable and 3 is not. Cal watched her do it. The careful mathematics of love operating under scarcity. He looked away. Foot said anything official, she asked. No, Cal said. Nothing official. Just noise. Noise has a way of becoming something else, out here, she said. He picked up the reins. Not always, he said. Sometimes it's just noise. She looked at the road ahead and said nothing more, but he heard what she did not say, and it settled in the air between them like the cold, present, specific, and requiring acknowledgement. The man called Spratt arrived on a Thursday night, 3 weeks into December, when the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that had its own vocabulary, the kind that made nails shrink in wood and water freeze inside pipes and any living thing that could find shelter. Find it. Cal heard him before he saw him. He had developed the habit of light sleeping in the barn loft, partly constitution, partly the particular alertness that settles into a man who has spent years in places where being caught unaware carried consequences. He heard Gideon's ears change direction before he heard anything else, that small, almost inaudible shift in the animal's breathing that meant something was wrong with the perimeter of the night. Cal was off the loft ladder with his boots on and his rifle in hand before the barn door creaked. He did not move immediately. He stood in the dark behind the roan cow's stall, where the shadows were deepest and the smell of hay and animal warmth would cover his scent. And he waited with the patience of a man who has learned that patience is usually the most effective weapon available. Spratt pushed the barn door open 8 inches and stood in the gap, silhouetted against the thin, blue-white light of a 3/4 moon on snow. He was holding a lantern unlit, which meant he had planned to light it once inside, which meant he had planned to be in the barn for some time, which meant he had come to do more than look. I know you're in here, Spratt said to the dark, in the tone of a man who is not entirely sure of this. Cal said nothing. Spratt took 1 step inside. Then another. He was looking toward the loft ladder, which was where a man sleeping in a barn would be expected to be found. Lyle Caswell sends his regards, Spratt said, still to the dark. He says the widow would do well to think about her situation. That ranch title is complicated. Caswell family property by right of blood, the way some see it. A widow on her own, 2 kids, winter coming on hard, that's a difficult situation. Be a shame if it got more difficult. The roan cow shifted and Spratt turned toward the sound, and Cal stepped out from the shadow and levered the rifle in one quiet, complete motion. Spratt stopped as if the sound had nailed his boots to the floor. Set the lantern down, Cal said. Spratt set it down. You rode 40 miles in this cold to stand in a stranger's barn and deliver a message that could have been sent by post, Cal said. He kept his voice even and flat, the way you keep a fire at a steady temperature, controlled, providing exactly what is needed and not more. That tells me the message was less important than looking at what is here. Spratt said nothing. Look at it, then, Cal said. Look at the fence line that was repaired. Look at the barn that has been cleaned and maintained. Look at the cattle that are fed and in their proper pens. Look at this rifle in my hands. He paused. Now tell Lyle Caswell what you saw. He'll want more than a look, Spratt said. The bravado was thin, a performance for an audience that wasn't buying it. He's welcome to come himself, Cal said. Anytime. In daylight. Through the front gate. I will meet him there. He moved 3 steps to his left and opened the barn door wide with his boot. The cold came in off the snow like something alive. Ride back the way you came. Sprat picked up his lantern and went. Cal listened to the sound of hooves on frozen ground diminish south and kept listening until there was only wind. He stood in the open barn door for a long while after that, watching the darkness, watching the house. A light came on in the second-floor window, Ruth's window, and he understood she had heard Gideon's reaction and had been awake listening. The light stayed on. He did not go to the house. He went back to the loft and lay down with the rifle beside him and his eyes open. In the morning, before the children were up, he went to the house and knocked, and Ruth opened the door in her house dress with her hair in a loose braid and her eyes carrying the evidence of a sleepless night. He told her plainly what had happened. All of it. She listened with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw set in the particular way a person holds themselves together when they are very close to the edge of what they can hold. Lyle, she said. Just the name. Like a weather forecast. He won't do anything direct, Cal said. He'll work through the county. The title on this land, how clear is it? Ruth looked at the fire. Dean's name on the deed. His name only. She looked back at Cal. I've been meaning to see the county registrar since October and I haven't had the... She stopped. Did not finish the sentence. Did not need to. Then that's the next thing, Cal said. She nodded. Once. The motion was small but it was complete. He went back to the barn and stayed in the cold and thought about Lyle Caswell and the title problem and the judge and Mrs. Aldrich and the children eating peppermints on a buckboard in the thin December light, and by the time he had finished thinking, he had arrived at a conclusion that surprised him somewhat. Though perhaps it should not have. He was not going anywhere. He had not had anything to defend in a long time. The feeling of it was strange, heavy, like the first time you pick up a tool you have not held in years and your hands remember the weight before your mind does. The land registrar's office in Harlan's Ferry shared its single small room with the dentist, as previously noted, and on the morning that Cal Danner and Ruth Caswell walked through its door, the dentist was in and the registrar was late. Which meant they sat for 20 minutes on a wooden bench while a man in the chair beside the registrar's desk had a back molar attended to with the methodical enthusiasm of a man who enjoys his work. Thomas and Nora had been left with a neighboring rancher's wife, a broad, kind woman named Mrs. Thorpe, who had appeared at the Caswell property 2 days after the incident with Spratt, bringing a venison roast and a silence on the subject of what was none of her business that Cal found deeply respectful. She had 3 children of her own and had looked at Thomas and Nora with the uncomplicated warmth of a woman who could always find room. The registrar, when he arrived, was a small man named Beecham, with spectacles and the cautious demeanor of someone who has spent years managing other people's disputes and has learned to be careful with all of them. Ruth explained the situation precisely and without emotion, which Cal observed took considerable effort. She explained that Dean Caswell had died in October, that the deed was in Dean's name only, that she had 2 minor children, and that she had been made aware through, she paused, an informal communication that there was a possibility the property might be subject to challenge by another member of the Caswell family. Beecham took notes. The law in this territory, he said, carefully, is that a widow is entitled to no less than 1/3 of the marital estate, with the remainder held in trust for minor children. However, if the deed is in the husband's name only and there is no surviving will, the process of establishing her legal right to maintain residence and operation of the property requires a formal filing, witness signatures, and the posting of a notice. He looked over his spectacles. A Caswell blood relation who made a claim prior to that filing having been processed would create a complication. How large a complication? Cal asked. Beecham considered. Considerable, he admitted. The room was quiet for a moment except for the sound of the dentist's work. Ruth looked at her hands in her lap. Then she looked up. What would remove the complication? She asked. Beecham set his pen down and took his spectacles off and polished them with a small cloth in the way of a man who is about to say something that requires a certain amount of preparatory ceremony. The simplest resolution, he said, would be if the property were under the legal ownership of a living adult who was not subject to the Caswell family claim. He replaced his spectacles. a deed transfer, or a change in the legal status of the resident party. He paused. Marriage, for instance, creates an immediate and clear legal claim that supersedes a collateral blood relations challenge, particularly where minor children are established. The word settled in the room. Cal looked at the wall. Ruth looked at the registrar's desk. The dentist, entirely unbothered, continued his work. "I want to be clear," Beecham said, "that I am not making a social suggestion. I am describing the legal landscape as it exists." Ruth stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the main street of Harlan's Ferry, at the thin December light coming off the snow, at the buckboard tied at the rail, at the ordinary, particular shape of the life she was trying to hold together. Cal watched her. He had thought about this. He had thought about it in the barn loft and at the fence line and over the woodpile and in the particular way of a man who does not think about something directly but circles it at increasing closeness until the thinking is done. "Mrs. Caswell," he said. She turned from the window. "I am not going to tell you what the right thing is," he said. "You know what the right thing is. You've been knowing it and doing it every day since October without anyone helping you do it." He paused. He turned his hat in his hands once. "What I will tell you is that I do not have anywhere else to be. And those children," he stopped. Started again. "They deserve to not have this resolved against them. Whatever you decide, I will sign whatever paper makes that so." Ruth Caswell looked at him for a long time with those steady, river-brown eyes. "It would be an arrangement," she said carefully. "For legal purposes. Whatever you need it to be," he said. She nodded. Turned to Beecham. "What do we need to sign?" They were married by Justice of the Peace Clement Foote, which contained an irony that Cal appreciated privately. At 4:00 in the afternoon on the 18th of December, in the same office where Foote had questioned the arrangement 3 weeks prior. Foote performed the ceremony with the precision of a man who has decided to be professional about something he finds personally complicated, which Cal respected. Mrs. Aldrich, who witnessed it, said nothing during the ceremony and something quietly to a woman beside her afterward. And Cal caught Ruth's eye across the room and Ruth shook her head almost imperceptibly, and he understood that this, too, was a thing that could be let go. The deed was refiled the following day with both names. When Lyle Caswell rode into Harlan's Ferry 4 days later, having heard from Spratt about the situation and having taken time to consult with a man he called a lawyer but who was primarily a man who knew which county clerk could be argued with, Beecham showed him the filing with the particular satisfaction of a small man who has been given the rare gift of settling something clearly and legally with no ambiguity remaining. Lyle Caswell stood in the registrar's office for a long moment, reading the document. He looked up. He looked at Beecham. He looked back at the document. "This was done in a hurry," he said. "It was done correctly," Beecham said. "Which is the relevant fact." Lyle folded the document and set it back on the desk and set his hat on his head and walked out of the office. And that was the last thing that anyone in Harlan's Ferry heard from Lyle Caswell on the subject of the Caswell Ranch for the remainder of that winter and the winter following. Judge Foote, for his part, had a conversation with Cal the following week in front of the feed store that was entirely different in character from their previous one. He talked about the weather and the condition of the roads, and at the end of the conversation he said, somewhat abruptly, "You put that ranch back on its feet in under a month." He said it in the tone of a man amending a ledger entry. "That's something." "The ranch was already on its feet," Cal said. "It just needed someone standing beside it for a while." Foote nodded and went on his way, and Mrs. Aldrich, who had been exiting the dry goods store across the street and had heard this exchange, found when she reached her counter that morning that she had rather less to say on the subject of Ruth Caswell than she had previously. Not because she had been convinced exactly, but because the wind had changed direction, the way winds do when something permanent has been decided. And she had the instinct of long experience to know when a subject had closed. The town's murmur subsided the way murmurs do, not all at once, but gradually, as other things arrived to occupy its attention. A dispute over grazing rights 2 ranches to the north. A preacher's unexpected departure. A spring that had always been public being fenced by a new landowner. The Caswell Ranch, the Dana Ranch, now. In the way these things shifted, receded from the town's active speculation and became simply a place where lights were on in the mornings and the fence lines were maintained. On Christmas morning, Thomas woke before light and came to the kitchen and found Cal already at the stove and a small paper twist of lemon drops beside his plate. Because Cal had heard the boy mention 3 weeks prior that his throat got raw in cold weather, and had remembered, and had bought them in town and kept them until now. Thomas stared at the lemon drops for a moment and then sat down and said nothing, and ate his breakfast with the careful, full attention of someone who has learned to trust that there will be more. Nora came down and found her coat on the peg with a small patch of red wool at the collar, replacing the grey patch that had come from a different coat and had never matched. She touched it. Looked at Cal. He was looking at the stove. She sat down. Ruth came last. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table, at the fire and the children and the food and the morning, and she looked at Cal with an expression that had no performance in it. Nothing managed or careful. Just the plain, open face of a person looking at something real. He poured her coffee and put it on the table and sat back down. Outside, snow was falling in the particular way of a Montana Christmas morning, straight down, heavy and quiet. Covering the fence lines and the barn roof and the frozen creek bank and all the evidence of difficulty with a temporary, beautiful patience. The cattle were in their proper pens. The fire was going. The roof held. There is a particular kind of grace that comes to broken places. Not immediately. Not cleanly. It comes the way spring comes to high country, slowly, with setbacks, with days that feel like winter returning just when you've stopped expecting it. But it comes. The Caswell Ranch had been breaking by inches since October, by cold and grief and the grinding arithmetic of too much need and too little help. What saved it was not dramatic. It was a fence post reset in frozen ground. A fire built before light. A bowl of soup carried to a sick woman's bedside without ceremony or expectation. 2 children who needed to be seen as capable and were. A man who had nowhere to be and chose, deliberately and with full knowledge, to be somewhere specific. There are people who move through the world and leave it warmer than they found it. Not because they are grand or extraordinary, but because they pay attention. Because they see what is needed and respond to it plainly, without calculating what they will receive in return. And there are places, and people, that seem beyond saving, worn to the bone, leaning southwest like an old fence post, who are not, in fact, beyond saving. They are simply waiting for someone to come along and set the post straight. To drive it deep. To tamp the earth back around the base. And stand there, after, to make sure it holds. Winter is long in the high country. But it ends. It always ends. And that, right there, is the kind of story that reminds you what people are capable of when they choose to show up. If this moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment, tell me what part hit you hardest. And if you're new here, welcome home. Subscribe and come back. There are more stories where this one came from, and every single one of them is worth your time.